A viewer contacted the Verify team asking whether Barack Obama could be named as Biden's VP. We looked into it as our Evan Kozloff has the answer.
The Verify team is here to separate social media fact from social media fiction. And the questions all come from you. Take this one.
Hello, this is Patrick Young from Anyhead, Maryland. I was wondering if President Barack Obama could become Joe Biden's vice president.
Good question, so let's verify. Can a former president who has served 2 terms be named vice president? Our main source today is the Constitution, namely the 12th Amendment and the 22nd Amendment.
First of all, it would be terrible politics.
We also caught up with politics professor Gary Nordlinger from the George Washington University. Let's start with the 22nd Amendment, which reads in part, quote, "No person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice." So this pretty clearly says that you can't be elected for a 3rd term as president. But what about VP? For that, we turn to the 12th Amendment. Quote, "No person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president of the United States."
But it's been interpreted to say that the vice president has to have the same qualifications as the president.
And typically we're thinking of things like your age or your nationality. But Nordlinger says this likely applies to term limits as well.
If anyone tried this, it would sure end up at the Supreme Court, because that's, who decides conflicts within the Constitution.
So we can verify false. Our experts tell us that the Constitution has language against this. And if Barack Obama were selected, it would almost certainly lead to a legal challenge. With your Verify, this is Evan Kozloff.